Welcome back to another special edition of JMC Live. We still have Mr. Sean Wrench on the phone. The Forsaken Generation. Now, this is something that connects to me, and it hits me at heart because I was 18 and 19 when I was homeless, and I know the whole stigma of being homeless as a young person and how you're treated. Yeah, people treat you bad. You have men and women that are pedophiles that try and trace after the children. You have people try and use you and abuse you. I'm reminded of like Oliver Twist with his story, meeting up with the kids that were like stealing on the streets. So there's a lot of temptations. There's a lot of things that come at you, and the stigma of being homeless shouldn't exist anymore. I think it's pretty close to a typical stereotype that's been going on in society with how people perceive and their perception of when a person says, "I'm homeless." Well, it must be your fault. You've had to use drugs and alcohol, and you must have a criminal record, and or your parents have done something wrong. And Sean, can you expound on what you've seen through youth homelessness, that this false truth doesn't really exist anymore? It's not a common thing to see a youth person.
Really, yeah, Jeremy, I'm really glad you brought that up. It's such a key point in what we're trying to accomplish. I was one of those people that bought into the stereotype before I started this organization. You hear the term homeless, and I think you instantaneously think of the wino type individual, if you will, who is on the street corner asking for money, and you instantaneously judge him and think that he's just asking for it because he wants to go out and get alcohol. And I think that our society has kind of developed a stereotype around homelessness, and that's our stereotype. And so our goal is to change that, and that's why we want to go all around the country telling stories of kids that are homeless have no fault to their own. But you know what, though? The bottom line is this. As a follower of Christ, our job isn't to judge them whether or not it is their fault or not. Our job is to love them, and that's because that's what Jesus did.
Yeah, I'm looking at the statistics right now that you have, and they're pretty up to date, and I'm going to go ahead and share it with everyone.
Sure.
We predict 1.5 million children are homeless right now, and
that number is actually substantially lower than what it really is, but
yeah.
It's kind of a long story behind that.
And if you include the ones that are like living with other people, or gotten an opportunity to do something better, or they're in jail or something, so you take all the different variables, it goes up to 2.8 million children.
Correct. And Jeremy, I want to bring up a point about something you said earlier. There was a young girl that we had talked to, and she said something to us that really floored us. She said, the hardest thing about being homeless is that you're tempted to do things to make your situation worse. And that's the reality of what these kids are facing, is you got a 17, 18-year-old kid who's on the street, and they're homeless, and they have no food, they have no clothes, and so they feel like they're stuck and there's no escape, and they often resort to doing things that make their situation homeless, and now they fall into a whole other set of problems. And so, we were just talking about this last night, a friend of mine and I. The 7-year-old child whose mother is a drug addict and whose father left years ago, they didn't ask for that situation. And so, even though there's definitely a percentage of the population out there that maybe is responsible for the situation they're in, there's a very good percentage that's not. And so we want to tell these kids stories. We want people to know that these kids need help, and that many of them are facing these horrible situations of no fault of their own whatsoever. And that number that you said, originally the National Coalition for the Homeless did a study. They came back and they said that 1.5 million kids were homeless. Senator Jim McDermott from Washington State did a study of his own, and when they finished their study, they said that the number was much closer to 2.8 million. We've done a lot of research on this over the last year, and unfortunately, I think that even that 2.8 is much, much lower than what it really is, because there's so many kids out there that are homeless, but yet they don't necessarily fall into what I guess would say is our government's definition of homeless. They don't have, maybe they don't have family, they don't have a place to stay, they're staying at a friend, their welcome wears out at one friend's house, they move on to the next friend's house. You know, that kid, for all intents and purposes, is homeless. They don't have a home of their own. They're what we call couch surfing. And so we want to be able to help the kids that are in these shelters, but we also want to really try to help kids that don't necessarily fall into the technical definition of homelessness, but for all intents and purposes, they are homeless.
Mm-hmm. And I'm seeing that they're saying about 42% are probably under the age of 6 years old.
Yeah, that's correct. Yep. Almost half of homeless children or homeless youth are under the age of 6 years old. It's a very sobering statistic, and what we found is a lot of that number has to do. There's a lot of single moms with children that are homeless. That actually, I don't recall the percentage. They did a study, and I think I want to say it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 40% of the homeless population was single mothers with children, and so that's why that number is so high. And you know, you got a single mom who is struggling to make ends meet, and now all of a sudden she loses her job and she's homeless, and so you now have 2 people or 3 people that are homeless, depending on how many children she has, and we're seeing, unfortunately, a very, very high rise in that number. And as a matter of fact, the highest, the biggest number that's rising in the homeless population in general across the country now is kids. It makes up for, I think it makes up for almost 30% of the total homeless population. It's really sad.
Mm-hmm. And then we have 32% are forced to participate in sexual activities against their will, which leads to sex trafficking. And I've seen this personally when I was homeless. There was a woman who had children, and they were different various ages, and she would date different men. And then there were times there were just various men that would come over, and you would see them go into the kid's room, and then the light would go off, and then the light would come on, you know, and you could hear the kids probably screaming or something, and you couldn't. I'm like, well, what are you supposed to do? It's like you would call the police, and by the time they got there, sometimes they would do something, sometimes they wouldn't. And if there's a single parent and they have a child of a certain age, I mean, the temptation is there for the parent, the temptation is there for the kid. If they are of age and have already hit puberty, you have this whole desperate need to cling on to anyone and anything. And if someone offers you money in exchange for a service, and you're homeless, you're more than likely to do it than you would if you were, you know, fiscally, you know, sound-minded. Because when you become homeless, you end up going into this mental torment of, I need to try and get ahead, and there's no hope for me, and I can't do anything. And then, which leads to, you know, a third of homeless people, you know, attempting suicide, and 13 homeless children die every day. So I want people to realize out there, before we take our break, that God has a plan, a hope, and a future for everyone. And when we come back from this break, we're going to talk more about what Sean is doing with the Homeless Project, and we'll talk about his petition. We will return.